Thank you.
So I think that segues nicely into, and we talked about this earlier, kind of the protocol for cannabis assisted therapy. But I did have uh, two sort of devil's advocate questions that I wanted to throw out there before we got into it, because we've been talking a lot about the positive effects, but there are some things that I can see where I can go, I can understand why people are very hesitant about this. The first one is this idea of people smoking themselves stupid. Like I have met at least two, definitely more than two, but two where like I know their face, I know their name, I know exactly the progress as I watched it happen. Where you know they start smoking and then they're smoking every day, and then they're smoking you know, just biblical amounts every day, and then eventually you talk to them and they're just dumb, like ridiculously dumb. And what's going on there? Because I've seen it happen. I've watched the progress happen as somebody just progressively gets more dumb as they are smoking more and more often. Is that entirely the cannabis? Is it part of just their own decline and the cannabis is part of it? Like, what's going on there?
So I want to sort of address that a little bit personally. I smoked my way through graduate school.
Awesome.
And when I came out of graduate school, I said to myself, if I can do this, there's no reason that that pothead mentality has to be true. Um, I have a lot of friends, colleagues that say to me, how do you not get the munchies? I'm going to answer your question the same way that I would answer that question. What we at Flora Quest do is stress the work that you do. Yes, at times you can smoke yourself to the point of openness that Dr. Lonnie was talking about, where you're just silly and happy. But I think that the mind is an amazing thing, and if you don't disregard it, there is no reason why you can't be a successful professional who has good relationships, who doesn't lie, steal, or cheat, who is successful. I think that it becomes more of a mentality and a personality. And that's
Mhm.
why a lot of what we do is screen for our plant medicine assisted therapy sessions. Is It's not for everybody. And really making a point that there are things that are contraindicated for plant medicine. And if you are more of a lazy person, this is the same thing that goes into an evaluation for a gastric bypass surgery. If you're a lazy person and you're not committed to succeeding and working in a positive way, then you are going to let yourself sit on the couch, watch Netflix for 5 hours, and eat a bag of Doritos. But if you're actually in tune with yourself and you use this as medicine, then that's going to happen less. So I think that that becomes a personal journey and how
Mhm.
we choose to use it. We also recommend what's called a tolerance break or a tea break, because so the definition of addiction is that there has to be a tolerance and there
Mhm.
has to be withdrawal. So we do have a tolerance, but physiologically there's not a withdrawal. There's a behavioral withdrawal. There becomes an I'm irritable and I need it because it was my coping. It was part of my toolbox. And now you took one of those tools away and I really miss it because I've come to rely on it, which is why we also encourage these tolerance breaks to tap into other coping strategies and other coping skills that you have besides just relying on plant medicine.
No, that makes sense. I mean, admittedly, the people I'm thinking of were probably heading in that direction anyway. But there was definitely, hey, this started this increase. Like there was a correlation there that was pretty strong. Bill, go ahead.
So basically, that reminded me of when I got out of the service, I worked with a lot of people in treatment, a lot of veterans in treatment, and I don't know the real medical term for it, but we had a lot of people, at least three that came through that were alcoholics and had basically spent their life drinking excessively. And one of the doctors can tell me the real term, but we basically called them wet brain, to where they were like, it was, they hadn't had a drink in years, but you could tell that the mind had been altered, through
Mm.
consistent over alcohol use or abuse. And when you were talking about, you had a friend and they just turned into a smoking dragon, right? And they went. I don't know if you could delineate how far they went from their intelligence level or their ability to cope or whatever to where you see that there was such a decline. I feel like it's a very similar thing. The alcohol obviously is more at fault, but with the habits, and like what Dr. Hillary was saying, if we develop the habit of utilizing that for a specific reason, it's going to continue to be, your mind is going to continue to grow, or the neural pathways are going to keep going down that line. It's not going to change. So if you're doing it just to get high, and you want to get high and you keep getting high, well, you are developing that neural pathway. You are and burning out all the others, literally burning them out, because you're not giving them any strength. You're not giving them any additional, resources.
That makes a ton of sense. Thank you. Uh, Dr. Lonnie?
Just building a little bit upon what has been said already. This is, where I tell my patients too much of a good thing is not a good thing. So, the question I have, why are you over relying on it? And it usually has something to do with either avoidance or of an oversimplification with the problem, where they feel, and it's cultural also, more is better. Okay. And that's kind of what we're taught, a higher dose of this, a higher dose of that. Oh, go to the doctor, he's going to raise your dose. When in reality, this goes back to something we were talking about 10 minutes ago. It's interesting to see what the research is showing on medical cannabis. The research now is going so far the other direction in terms of ultra low dose THC. So things that people do not even think would have an effect on you medicinally, it does have an effect. 1 to 3 milligrams of THC taken on a daily basis is not going to give you any perception of feeling stoned, but it has incredible medicinal benefits. So the
Yep.
reality is, how are we, approaching life? Okay, are we doing it in the sense that it's easy because I take it in a pill form, or are we doing this mindfully, where I'm actually looking at what I need? Dr. Meg talked about something regarding cannabis. People don't understand. You look at it and you see one plant, but really take a look at it scientifically. They've studied about 567 different compounds in it, and there are more that still need research, about 160 plus cannabinoids. Then you have some things called terpenoids and things called flavonoids. So the terpenoids or terpenes give it smell. They come from all fruits and vegetables. Flavonoids give it color. But now you start to look at it scientifically, and holy crud, all of these different things, you stack them up and they have incredible medicinal benefits. And now you start to see certain strains of cannabis that have high levels of this, high levels of that, and the other thing. And now you understand why it's good for pain, or why it's good for this, for anxiety and what have you, because it's like playing a symphony. Okay. I had to learn how to play each particular instrument, but now I'm the conductor and I know how to make it sound the way I want. Making CBD, understanding the patient's needs, being able to guide them, is really taking a look at what parts of the plant can benefit them. Because there are things like CBG, cannabigerol. This is different than CBD. It has incredible benefits for pain. It also has things that it does amazing things for your appetite. I mean, I experimented with CBGA, so the A just means the acidic or raw compound. And oh my God, I didn't eat for 2 weeks. That was not a good amount. I learned tiny amounts work. So we, in this discovery of how to make this work, we try a lot of things. But the beauty is tiny, tiny amounts do what we want them to do, but it's not magic. Going back to a comment I made about Michael Pollan's book, wonderful that he brought this for discussion, but there's so much more to it we have to work also. So if I am using cannabis in order to deal with my anxiety, I'm thinking of a patient now, a veteran, this guy was smoking, what was it, an ounce of indica cannabis every 4 days. Okay, you understand that's a massive amount. Driving to work, 2 king-size cones, each one over a gram of cannabis in it. Okay, he was so nervous, PTSD, and he's thinking, oh, the indica is going to calm me down, and he's getting worse. By the time he got to me, and I educated him that THC in high doses, in low doses, it's an anxiolytic. It helps with anxiety, but high doses can really trigger and create anxiety. So that's when I educated him about CBD. And here we are today. He has reduced his amount of cannabis consumption so dramatically. He's bought CBD, he's changed all of his behaviors, and he's feeling so much better. But this is the mentality that we're given in this culture, in my opinion, is that more is better. Does that explanation make sense?
It does. It does. I mean, I think you're talking a little bit about microdosing, which I've heard of, and I don't get fully. I'll admit, but we can get into that. I did want to give Dr. Meg a chance to speak. Uh, you're on mute again.
There we go. I think that just to build off of something that that all of us are bringing up is the infiltration of the recreational market into our everyday engagement with plant-based substances. And one of the things that we have seen, particularly with the, inaugural legalization of cannabis in California, for instance, and then moving to other, both medical and recreational markets throughout the country, is strains of cannabis that are cultivated to have higher and higher concentrations of THC. And that is one of the ways that people are encountering cannabis now, that is very different from what they would have encountered 30 to 40 years ago if they had just smoked a joint. And we don't, frankly, know the safety implications of this long term. There was a study that came out from a group of researchers in Toulouse, France, not long ago that has kind of made a big splash in the wellness sphere, where they were looking at, people who were users, but they were primarily chronic users,
Mhm.
chronic users of chronic, I guess, who were smoking regularly. They were either, smoking flower or they were vaping. And they did see compromised endothelial function, so a little bit of heart dysregulation within those patients. But it's a little challenging to parse that out because it's a single study. It was a relatively small sample size. There was not a control for diet within this, so we don't know if there were other factors that were affecting, the results of those things. So, but I do think it merits observation, to go, I think, back to your original question of, is there potential harm? I think there absolutely is potential for harm, but that is where, clinicians like Dr. Hillary and Dr. Lonnie and others come in, where they have a strong education about the widespread, and we'll probably get into this concept of entourage effect of these plant substances happen to be, and how they can be consumed in very, very minimal doses that have much less of an impact on the body than these highly, highly engineered strains that are intended really just to get you high.
Dr. Lonnie?
No, this is a great discussion. Dr. Meg brought up an interesting point, reminded me of an article, 1999, I believe, Dr. Ethan Russo, where he talked about, in this case, the entourage effect was the term, where it was looking at Taming THC is the article. So he's looking at THC. THC alone is a really rough substance. Okay, it's not a good feeling to just have THC alone. This is something that Marinol was created by pharmaceutical companies. They have to give this with cannabis in order for it to be tolerated by the body and not dysphoric to the patient. So understanding that, there's the entourage is not one molecule, but literally a symphony of molecules that work in concert together. And, if you have THC, what makes THC, because regardless of the strain, so you have sativas, which are uplifting, cerebral, you have hybrids, which are a combination, and you have indicas, which are body or relaxing type ones, sedating ones. THC is the same molecule in all of them. What makes them hit you differently are the terpenes and the flavonoids. So there are terpenes that stimulate, terpenes that sedate, terpenes for the mind, terpenes for the body. And understanding how to use them is really the art behind this. So knowing when you go into a dispensary what products to select, looking at the ultra low dose as a good starting point, because from a medicinal point of view, I mean, dude, if you want to go out and get high, you don't need me. You don't need us. Go have fun. Okay. But on the other end, if you want to learn how to do this in a therapeutic sense, clearly there is a clinical approach to this. In terms of our mentalities, it's reminds me of a comment from boxing. Okay, so a fighter is sitting there, he's boxing, and he hits somebody, he gets a right hand across, and now he's throwing right hand after right hand, so he's right hand crazy. And that's what people tend to do, is they tend to over rely on one thing rather than balance. And literally the work that we teach is balance in life. So when we get a person who is looking to come to us to get the guidance that we offer, is this person ready to be in balance with themselves? Because if they're just looking for a quick fix, this is not what this is about. This type of work requires a person who's ready to work, ready to understand what they're bringing to this party. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, if you're too much of this, too little of that, what are you willing to do to overcome this? Because cannabis is an adjunct. I'm thinking right now of an article that I came across from the 1960s. Okay, so Dr. Meg, you brought this up a while back in our conversation. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, LSD was discovered in a laboratory, in Sandoz laboratories, and they didn't know what the heck, it did. So they started to send this all over the world to scientists and doctors. And it's like, here, use this and tell us what it does. In the 50s and 60s, there was an amazing amount of research on the west coast of this country and in places like Canada, where they did remarkable things. They were working in hospitals and they were treating incredible populations and doing a lot of research in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. People don't really understand, Alcoholics Anonymous, everyone's heard of this. The person who started it, Bill Wilson, do you know where he got his epiphany to start it from? Working with a famous psychiatrist, Humphrey Osmond, and Dr. Osmond, he helped him with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and he had this epiphany that you can't do it without spirituality. So literally, the roots of something that's gotten people off of alcohol comes back to plant-based medicine. Now, looking at what I'm talking about, where you start to understand tiny amounts of a substance can do profound things. You brought up the concept of microdosing a few minutes back. Microdosing is literally a principle of self-growth where it involves a process of change that's intentional. Okay, the substance is not central to it. The substance is an adjunct or an adjuvant, as Dr. Herman talked about. In the 1960s, this person did seminal research. He was a researcher, a psychiatrist, and he talked about cannabis being an adjunct to psychotherapy, and that's what really brought us to do this. But really understanding that psychedelics, and cannabis is a psychedelic, it works on the same receptors as the stronger, more known psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, and things like that. It does it in a different way, though. Those substances that are stronger will kick the door of the ego open, meaning it just shuts down your ego and you see things a different way. Cannabis in indigenous societies is a master plant, and it's something that requires more work on your part to be present in the moment, but it literally opens the door the same way. The openness that I spoke about is really what's created in that therapeutic session through the use of cannabis, and your presence in the moment is there as opposed to the others where you kind of have to do a lot of work to figure out what you realized during a psychedelic trip. So there's a lot of journaling that goes into this process, but understanding that when you take a little bit of a substance, so microdosing, most people think of it in terms of mushrooms and LSD and things like that, where it is a sub psychedelic, meaning it's not going to give you the hallucinatory symptoms. You're still in full control, but you're right on the edge. And what it does is it creates this awareness, this semi-openness, so you can hear and see different things inside your mind that you might not have in that state without it. But there's a preparation that goes into this. Okay, so part of what we do to see if you're a good candidate for our services is we screen you. We want to know, what kind of person are you? Do you work in terms of self-growth? Because that's really what's required to get the most out of what we offer. In terms of psychedelic assisted therapy, it's mostly work. The substance alone just gives you an insight. Nothing's going to change if you don't change anything. So
Yep.
the microdosing, it's not a daily habit. And this is where I find sometimes people start to confuse this with more of a pharmaceutical approach, where we're just going to give you 0.25 milligrams of the substance every day. No, that's dependence. I don't want you to depend on it. I want you to work on it. So when you use a microdose, it's literally 5 days a week, let's say if we're talking psilocybin, where I'm going to ask you to use it, but mindfully use it, okay? Tiny amounts. So when I'm talking tiny amounts, we're talking 0.012 to 0.018 milligrams of psilocybin, which is tiny. You're not going to even feel high, but all of a sudden your mood's going to be good, your mind's going to be clear, you're going to have a lot of energy, and you're going to be open to hearing feedback about things. It's incredible what it does, but you're not high. So if we do this for 5 days during the week, we need 2 days off for the receptors to reset biochemically. You can do this, let's say 2 or 3 days, take a day off, 2 or 3 days, or 5 days in a row. But again, we're also not encountering dependence at that point, because the beauty is that you're also working. You're learning to meditate, you're journaling, you're exercising, you're taking care of your body. We teach so many different disciplines in terms of how a person can change. But we're a guide. We can guide you, but we can't control you. So that's why what we offer, it really works best with certain kinds of people with higher levels of motivation.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. In my head, I'm just imagining swimming. If I don't know if it's a good analogy for everybody, but flippers obviously, they help you swim faster, but there can get to a size of flipper where if you're not a strong enough swimmer to start off with, they can drown you because you just don't have the ability to use it correctly. It, is that an apt analogy? I guess.
I actually feel it kind of is 100%. I mean, one of the things and it's not necessarily along the same lines as what they're talking about with the microdosing and utilizing these substances properly. But I have seen people in my encounters with veterans trying to find ways to overcome their obstacles, fighting the battle within and using these substances alone without help because they're intelligent enough to be able to go and see the research. They can see online that things are helping, but without help, without the assistance of somebody that's literally guiding them through that process, it can have exactly the opposite effect. Like you said, somebody swimming could drown, and it's very much the same thing. If you're using these substances and you're not being guided and you're just trying to silver bullet your way out of it, you can drown.
Dr. Meg?
Um, I'm kind of offering a footnote. I'm going to go back to something that Dr. Lonnie mentioned a moment ago when he was, describing the entourage effect. And I don't want to derail us from where I think we're going, which is really to talk about how these things can function within a clinical setting and what that looks like. But one of the things that I think bears mentioning is when we're talking about the medical community in the United States and people who are trained physicians, trained caregivers, trained to engage with pharmaceuticals in a specific way, the entourage effect is something that is actually quite troubling, because we have substances that are being ingested, that are going into the body, that have multiple functions, and that is not what pharmaceuticals are designed to do. Pharmaceuticals are developed specifically, usually, excuse me, to have one primary effect within the body, a dominant effect within the body. Yes, we know that there are also side effects to consuming many pharmaceuticals, but the notion is that it is kind of monodirectional, and physicians are very uncomfortable, understandably so, with substances that are going to have multiple effects throughout the body. Where that then sometimes happens, and I mentioned before that I'm a cancer patient or have been a cancer patient, you have people who are given drug cocktails where they have multiple substances that they're ingesting, multiple pharmaceuticals, but they're still intended, excuse me, to be monodirectional in their effect. And the notion when you create a cocktail is that they're working in consort, usually sometimes to manage the side effects of the primary drug that was being prescribed. And so I think that that is a sticking point for many clinicians who are in this space, who are very curious about plant-based medicine. There's a challenge there for people who have experienced a very specific type of training, who do want to protect their patients. And so part of what we do is try to invite them into this conversation to talk about, what are the implications of this? How are these substances, how can we talk about them and use them in ways that are protecting patient safety? Because I think at the end, we all have that goal, regardless of sort of where you exist within the space. And so I think that that gets us back to this conversation about microdosing, about minimally effective doses, and about how those can operate within a clinical setting while we are attuned to the multiplicity of effects that plant-based medicines can have within the body.
That makes sense. I mean, like from my perspective, if I'm a doctor, I probably would be iffy on something where I have to consider a whole lot of potential outcomes versus something where it's like, okay, well, there are other potential outcomes, but the big one is very is very noticeable. So I can understand that resistance in terms of, we talked about Western medicine, and that is really part of, I think, Western medicine is sort of the specificity of things. So yeah, that makes sense, and I find that that's usually, as we continue this podcast, as I continue my own growth as a person, one of the things that I keep running into is that a lot of times when there's conflict, it's more that there's just two different ways of looking at things, and there may not be, neither way may be wrong. It's just they're different, and we haven't yet figured out a way to reconcile both, if that makes any sense. Dr. Lonnie?
Excellent point that was just brought up. And, to take that a step further, a lot of Western trained doctors do not see cannabis or plant-based medicine for what it is. They've been taught that it's literally a drug of abuse that goes back 80 to 100 years or so. When we look at it today from a non-biased point of view, we see it as something that can be an incredible adjunct. So building on what Dr. Meg was talking about with respect to cannabis in particular, looking at the monodirectional use of allopathic or pharmaceutical medication, it's very specific. And some of these medications do an incredible job at killing the cancer, but they take a huge toll on the patient. So this is where a combination of the two different worlds is very powerful. So knowing, as a clinician skilled in this, that certain drugs rely on lowering the immune system so that the drug that the doctor gives you, the pharmaceutical medication, kills the cancer, it would be worked against if you were taking high levels of cannabis, which boost your immune system. So knowing this, we do a period of time where we get 3 to 5 days of the cannabis out of your system, allowing the other drugs to work better. And then there are other drugs, for cancer in particular that work incredibly well when combined with cannabis, because you're able to take higher levels of the drug and sustain, because you have lower side effects for a longer period of time. So this is where it's not one or the other, but both. Right now, we do not understand how 567 known compounds in the plant work directly with cancer. There has not been human research because of the laws being the way that they are. So the best we can do right now is to understand that there is a place for both, but you have to really work as a skilled clinician with a skilled medical doctor, and there has to be communication for the patient to get the best level of treatment. To understand that there are other types of ways that cannabis can help, looking at, an adjunct to meditation. Most people who are really going through medical problems, things like cancer, for example, their doctors are pointing them towards meditation. Well, meditation is doing basically the same types of things like we were talking about, that endocannabinoid system. Meditation is stimulating the production of these cannabinoids. So what we're really looking at is educating clinicians, not just the patients, but clinicians on how this can be a benefit to their patients.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And with that, I did want to segue because we have a little bit under 30 minutes left in the recording, but I did want to segue and give you all a chance to talk about what you do, how you do it, who it might help, and kind of get into the specificity of Flora Quest itself. Um, so I don't know who wants to kick it off or go, but I did want to make sure I give everybody that opportunity.
Well, I will start us off. We have come together and formed this company, Flora Quest, as people who are really believers in the therapeutic benefit of cannabis. We are not here telling you to get high, as Dr. Hillary said, because we're talking about cannabis in kids. We are not telling you to get them high. There's a part of the plant which is non-intoxicating. It is active in the sense that it does affect certain receptors that Zoloft and other antidepressants would work on, but it's not going to get you intoxicated. So when we look at educating patients, it's something that gives them an idea of what they can expect and can't expect from the plant. We give them an idea of how the plant, in this case we're talking cannabis, can help a patient to benefit more from psychotherapy. But it's not just that. We teach them about how the entire person needs to be dealt with. So it's not just their biology, it's not just the psychology, it's also spirituality that we bring into this equation. There are things that need to happen on all these different levels for change to take place and last. We also talk about things like we've heard Bill talking about, community. Okay, so if a person sits alone in their home, they're missing out on an important part of the human evolution as a species. We need community. So when we take a person in, we do this entire assessment that is a biopsychospiritual assessment where we look at them on all these different realms. We get an idea of who is coming to us for help and what are their areas that they're challenged in. And then we start to create an understanding of where they want to go, what are the goals that they have. And we look at whether or not plant medicine is something that could be helpful. So there are things that people don't realize, that if you have pre-existing conditions, there are some that really make psychedelics not a good idea. So for example, if you have psychosis that's uncontrolled, taking something that could potentially trigger that, not a good idea. Okay, and this is where a pre-screening comes in. Looking at the actual work, most people don't understand that you have to work also. They're used to going to a doctor and take this prescription and you'll be fine. So the amount of work that's required to change is what surprises a lot of people, but it's not hard. It's not rocket science. It's habit. You literally have to look at yourself and change your habits. Anything can be changed. We just need to understand it. So coming back to how we approach this, it's a thoughtful process of engaging a patient over time. There are three main phases of the psychedelic assisted therapy. So when I say psychedelic assisted therapy, there are two main components to it. One, the traditional psychedelics. So Some states you have access to plant-based psychedelics like psilocybin, but most states do not. The only psychedelic you have access to in all 50 states is something called ketamine, and that's prescribed by a medical doctor. It has very similar actions to the natural psychedelics, but it is a pharmaceutical drug. However, we can use it in very similar ways. So, coming back to how we practice the psychedelic assisted therapy, it really is more the therapeutic process, what we focus on, because we do not prescribe or administer drugs. What we do is we work with patients who have their own access to these substances. So let's say 38 states have a medical cannabis program. You're going to have access to CBD or cannabis in most of those areas, and this is what we work with. If you have a doctor that's willing to prescribe ketamine, there are many different doctors out there in on all states that do this, but we offer a program of how to use that substance to gain the results that you want through work and insight building. Is that a good start?
I think so. Dr. Meg, did you want to build on that?
Yeah, I'll just add an aside. Dr. Lonnie and Dr. Hillary are much better than I able to encapsulate what happens within a clinical setting at the personal level when we're talking about working with individual patients. Our group also, and I think Dr. Lonnie was getting to this at the end of his remarks, we also are an educational and a consulting resource for practices that are interested in incorporating plant-based medicine, but may not have the resources to do that as efficiently as possible. So we do work with groups who are emerging, in this wellness space, who are working with patients who are interested in using plant-based medicines. We're not there necessarily just to educate the patients, but we're actually there to educate doctors, there to educate therapists, there to educate other clinicians, so that they can use these substances effectively, so that they understand what the current state of research happens to be. That is part of our function. And then we also see, our role as getting effective information out to the public. So it's really kind of this three-pronged approach where we're talking at the clinical, personal level, we're talking about dealing specifically with clinicians and with physicians, and also talking about how we engage the public with really good scientifically backed research. That is sort of our core mission.
Awesome, awesome. So, I mean, I understand that physicians may be resistant to it, members of the public may be resistant to it. I also understand, one of the things that I kind of, or two of the things that I kind of keyed in on as we're during this talk and earlier in this conversation, is one, this idea of screening, which I think for specifically mental health help, which is what we talk about here on Better You, uh, that is to me so important because, as you've said, there is no silver bullet. There is no one size fits all, which is my own soapbox against some other therapy companies will remain nameless. And this idea, I think, that gets put out there of oh yeah, just this and then you're fine. I I personally really have a problem with. But the other thing that you're talking about, I really I really appreciate, goes along with that, I think, very very well, is this idea of you know you having to do the work, because like I was just saying, there's no there is no silver bullet, there is no whatever. If you're talking about something as important as your mental health, which is what we're talking about, um, you should put work into it, bless you. And I think there's a quote from a musician that I really like, Frank Turner, where he said, "Be suspicious of simple answers because that stuff is for fascists and maybe teenagers. And I think that really applies to mental health, where people are saying, oh yeah, just smoke weed and you'll be fine. Just do mushrooms and you'll be fine. That doesn't make sense to me. What you're talking about, and if it's not what you're talking about, please correct me, but what you're talking about to me sounds like, hey, this can really help, but you still have to do the work. Sorry, Dr. Lenny?
You're exactly right. It's something that if you don't have the motivation to do the work and you're relying on a substance, that's what I call avoidance. Okay, you're not dealing with the big pink elephant in the middle of the room that needs to be dealt with. I literally had a session this morning where, again, it's me doing what I do. I'm listening. I hear a person. I can guide, but I can't control. Understand, that's the keys. You're you. I'm just pointing you on this path. And when a person says, yeah, but, they're not hearing what I'm saying. I'm the guide, and I'm telling you, be careful. You slip over there and you could fall down the mountain. Yeah, but. And that's sort of the problem here, is that's the ego. Okay, and when the ego is strong, nothing we can do except sit back and let you go through until you're ready to submit. So this process of working with plant-based medicine requires you to be aware of the ego and how that can get in the way. And this brings me back to a comment that Bill had brought up earlier, and I think Bill and I know the person that is going through my mind right now, fallen hero, that, this is a guy who I feel terrible that, this is my field of specialty, and he did not ask me for help. Okay, he had learned somewhere that psychedelics, LSD, what have you, can help with trauma. He was a very decorated veteran. I mean, just one of these people, you look at him and you're like, holy crap, a superstar. And, he wound up hanging himself. Okay, so understanding that, if you don't have the clinical guidance to make this work the correct way, it can unfortunately hardwire your pathological ways. So it is not a harmless substance. That's why they consider in indigenous societies these as master plants. These are sacred substances not to be played with. In the 1950s, you had a person, an advertising executive, that wound up going to Mexico, and he met this curandera, and he talked her into doing a mushroom ceremony. And what did he do? He came back. It was a Life magazine article all over the planet, and that's when abusing mushrooms became the norm. And we started to really kind of take that and bring it into a different light. If you look historically, throughout like the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, they had the hashish societies in Europe, where these people that were incredible thinkers on the forefront were basically getting stoned using hashish, but they were doing amazing things. So a large part of this is how we use the substance. It's not the substance itself, it's the methodology behind it. And that's what we offer, is a methodology to take substances that have amazing potential, but bring them into a therapeutic format. And that's where the protocols that we've come up with are designed. We teach people a great deal about how to make this plant work, but it involves how to make you work. Okay? There's things like body work, for example, breath work, for example, things that you really don't see in a traditional psychotherapy setting. Okay? Traditional psychotherapy is about a 45-minute session, and basically we're talking. Sometimes you get a clinician that gives you homework. I'm one of those. I always give you something to take with you. But in the plant medicine sessions, they're a longer session. Okay, they last about an hour and a half to 2 hours. And we start off by things like meditation. We start off with things like guided imagery, breath work, body work, whatever the modalities the clinician brings in, and get that person into a receptive state. If it's cannabis or whatever substance, we allow for the onset. Okay, cannabis being pretty instant within about 2 minutes, but let's say it's microdosing with a psychedelic that's stronger like mushrooms. Now we need maybe a 45-minute onset. But the goal is to get that person to a relaxed state so that the body of work that we do is incredibly open and very therapeutic. And then we have a closing part of the session where we take the person through insights gained. We teach them things like journaling and other techniques. the substance use in a lot of ways is not the entire norm for our treatment of a patient. Typically, we tend to have at the beginning preparatory work. So there could be weeks to months of preparatory work building a patient for the use, especially if it's going to be a heroic or larger dose where there's psychoactivity involved. Uh, when that person has that substance session, that usually is something that is followed up by what's called integration sessions. So we teach them ahead of time, you got to capture that stuff. While the window of openness is there, you got to learn how to do artwork, how to journal, how to write down what you saw, what you heard. And then the integration therapy is something that does not involve the use of the substance, but can last for months, because now you've got about 60 hours of psychotherapy in a 60-minute session. So the beauty here is the work and the growth that comes from the consistent but directional work that we offer.
Makes sense. Bill?
As our team has kind of pointed out, I am always going to point toward community. And one of the things that we found is that a lot of people that are moving into the wellness space, they think that they're going to be able to do, most of it themselves. The reality of it is the most successful wellness plans, businesses that I've encountered are ones that realize there are a lot of necessities outside of what they're able to provide. Um, and we as a group, we not only have, not just my veteran friends and stuff like that, the organizations, but we are keyed in and tied in to a lot of different organizations that bring different healing modalities, everything from uh, the yogi that's going to teach you how to, do the body posture or whatever, or dance therapy, or, we have so many different connections and so many different communities. Part of what we do is when we're working with the clinicians and a new wellness program, we help to connect them to things that are already existing rather than building the wheel over and over again, giving them the opportunity or providing them with the opportunity to plug into these organizations that already exist.
Yeah, and that brings me to something that I think a lot of people, I I'll say, tend to misunderstand, in my opinion, about mental health. Is one, it is a process, and two, it's not a process that's the same for everybody. Um, I mean, you're talking about plant-based medicine, cannabis-assisted therapy, psychedelic-assisted therapy, and that is or could be incredibly beneficial for a lot of people. But like you said when we were talking about the screening, not for everybody. And I think that what tends to happen with mental health, and I see it happen all the time, is somebody comes back and they're feeling better, they're more chipper, and their friends and family kind of go, oh well, what did you do? And then they share, and then their friends and family want to hop on this, and then but they don't get the same results, and then they go, oh well, that thing doesn't work anymore, like that doesn't work, it was just there, my friend, my family, whatever, is the one off, maybe it was something else that was going on. And I think, and please correct me if I'm out in left field or off base here, but I think that does some level of harm to the mental health community, because just because something worked for somebody else doesn't mean it's going to work for you, and just because something isn't working for you doesn't mean that something's not going to work for somebody else, if that makes any sense.
Makes a lot of sense. And what's interesting, when I was in training in many decades ago, the term that they had, and it was a bad word back then, to be eclectic. Okay, to be eclectic. Ooh, I like this theory. I like this theory. I like these different parts of all these different theories. But no, we were bad if we liked psychoanalysis but were cognitive behavioral. So we were taught to stay in our lane. You're a psychodynamic therapist. You have to do it in the Freudian way. Okay, but there are limits to each different way that therapy is conducted. And the eclectic philosophy to me is doing what works. Okay. And there's a term that Bill knows what I'm thinking of right now. We're going to patent it before we talk about it. But the point is, we do what works. We do it on the fly. We teach people how to be creative in applying the different things that they've learned in their lives. There is no one way, as you point out, to do things, but there's more of a template with a variety of different tools that people can use. And this is where a relationship with a clinician that sees the person as an individual, that doesn't force the individual into the treatment, square peg, round hole. If we shave this edge, it fits. No, we teach people, what to look for and how to make it work. So bringing the individual into a conversation is really, the most important part, motivation. This is where I think the screening part that we were referring to earlier establishes that. A person coming to us, we need to find out how motivated you are to work. If you really are motivated, it's amazing what you can change. If you're not, you're going to be stuck. And it's not, a mystery why you're going in circles. Change nothing, nothing changes. But the beauty is that we as humans with this higher intellectual functioning have the ability to change anything we want. We can question our own thoughts. That's the height of awareness. And this is what things like meditation offer us. Do we need substances to achieve what we're talking about? No. But most people don't realize that and are not willing to do things like meditation, dancing, chanting, breathing, drumming, things like that. So in our society, in this modern sense, we use substances because it's a quick way of achieving these states without having to go through a great deal of retraining of our habits.
I just wanted to add to that. While we do screen our patients or our potential patients for plant medicine assisted therapy, we also, if somebody comes to us who is in need of doing the work, who wants to do the work, but is not a appropriate candidate for the plant medicine, Dr. Lonnie and I and Bill and Dr. Meg, we all still support and will work with a client. So we don't necessarily turn people away just because this is one of our specialties. We're also very educated about other modalities like Dr. Lonnie was talking about.
Yeah, and I think that that's part. I didn't mean to cut you off if you weren't finished, but I think that that's part of the reason why I saw such an alignment here, and Lamco Wellness kind of decided to back this podcast, and specifically this episode, in spite of the stigma around plant-based medicine that still exists. Is I think that people who are interested in helping people, which I definitely get from this conversation and previous conversations that we've had, that is core to the work. Is, hey, what can we do to help people? Like, one of the things Allie, who's usually on this, talks about all the time is, if people reach out to her, she's not, whether they work with us or not, or we can accept their insurance or anything like that, she'll say, I always try to make sure that they leave having the resources to at least take the next step, even if it's not with us. And I feel like I definitely relate and understand that that idea, and I think that that's very important for a lot of people when looking for any sort of mental health provider. Is, hey, are you going to be okay if I still find help somewhere else? And my own thought is, if you run into somebody who's not going to be okay if you find help somewhere else, they're probably not the best resource for you.
This is the beauty of what we do. This is something that we give away in this knowledge, this education. Obviously not everything, because there's so much to talk about, but we're giving people an idea that there's more than one way to approach handling their problems. And as one of my favorite quotations goes back a couple of 100 years ago, knowledge is power. Okay, when people understand something, they can better work with it. Okay, here, being a person who's inculcated into the field of psychotherapy, We were taught, you stay in your lane, talk to the patient, you refer them to a psychiatrist, they give them a medication from a pharmacy. Okay, in decades of doing this, I realized there are other ways to deal with problems. And some of them are less dependent on substance and more dependent on the inner work. Some, like the one that we're talking about today, is a beautiful compromise between the two. Okay, not everybody's willing to get up in the morning and do yoga or Tai Chi or meditate or eat healthy or what have you. So, we can't just say, one thing for everybody. On the other end, it's literally about educating people as to what is best for them. And that's what we like to offer through Flora Quest, is that insight. And that's why there is a screening to begin with. Because if this is not the best mode of treatment based on expectations or what have you, that's what we're trying to get at the beginning of our journey together. What will be best for that patient? And there are patients that have approached me for things like psychedelic therapy over the years, and we've wound up doing regular psychotherapy because, for whatever the reasons are, they were not appropriate for it.
Yeah. And oh, go ahead.
Excuse me, I think that's a pretty beautiful summation of how we all feel. And I think that if there's a takeaway from this conversation, it's that we as a group believe very profoundly that people have the ability to make significant changes in their lives, and they can do it by accessing a host of modalities that they may feel have historically been out of reach to them. And at the same time, we want to encourage people to seek help and seek guidance, as they're going on their own journeys, and to not try to journey alone. I think that we all profoundly believe and are invested in the concept of community and creating a supportive community for the people who reach out to us. And that's foundational, I think, for what we're trying to do, for what you guys at LAMCO are attempting to do, is just simply provide the tools that people can use themselves to change their existence and give them a sense of control in their own lives.
That was perfect. Thank you. I think I was going to try and wrap things up with something equally profound, but nailed it. So with that,
Always the
with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This is the people from Flora Quest. Please check them out. Like and subscribe, comment, all that usual stuff, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.